With this lecture series on erasure, we want to concentrate on the cultural editing processes of heritage. We ask how our elements of heritage jointly forgotten, erased, rendered invisible and neglected. This is why we are excited to hear Professor Kathryn S today, who has worked on Tamang song traditions since the 1970s, enough time to erase and forget some heritage.
This is part 2 of the first episode of the series titled Erasure. Part 1 was a lecture by Professor Kathryn S on Western Tamang dancing and ripost song known as Mhendomaya, Flowers of Love, to explore both continuity and change in this vibrant song tradition. In this second part of this episode, we will present our conversation with Professor S, drawing on the themes discussed in the lecture.
So much, Professor Maj, for that lecture. We'll start the discussion question answer series section of the program now. Stefanie and I'll start with a few questions, and then we'll take questions from the audience as well. So to start with, we were thinking the songs that you played showed quite a lot of changes over time. How it was sung was also changed over time. So we wondered what triggers this kind of change in song tradition, and looking back at your engagement with Western Tamang songs since 1970s, the tradition that were discontinued, and what do you think these discontinuations mean?
Yes, I want to emphasize, I think change, I know culture is a living thing. So it's at the moment, there are various moments when people want to sort of freeze culture and make it stand for something, or make it do something other than be culture, which is lie. It's a lie. It changes all the time. And so the problem with speculating backwards from 1975 backwards, I'd go to talk to women who were in their 40s at that time about what did they sing when they were young, and they could talk about what they saw young people singing today, and get them to talk about what had changed, and then I could go to the women who were in their 50s and 60s and a few even in their 70s talking about what has changed. All right, and you can go forward as well. So the 90s, there's this dark period when not much was happening, and then the revival, but so I think some of it is the pure pleasure of creative change. Why as a young woman would you want to sing something different from what your mother's saying? Or why as a young man would you want to sing something different from what your grandfather's saying? I think there's a truly creative tradition creates, and so there was a lot of pleasure in seeing those changes. Now you'd have to start thinking about other kinds of things, like when I think, for instance, about the dress, the radical changes that happened in that. I have to look very much into things in political economic history, because the blue and red skirts weren't blue and red, even in the living memory of some of the oldest women in the community. The blue got added. What the shama skirts, in the middle of them, there's a part that looks sort of patterned, and then there's the major field of blue. The skirts used to be patterned all the way across, and they used to have only mineral dyes, so they were kind of muddy red and muddy yellow and muddy brown and muddy, right? They were very subdued colors. And then dyes came into the market, and people bought dyes. And then a group of indigo dyers went into the Trisuli Bazaar, and oh my gosh, blue, that bright, bright blue. So what we talk of as traditional dress itself had changed over time. I know that when it changed to market-based lungi, there was an explicit effort on the part of the cloth merchants in the Trisuli market to mark up the cost of thread and mark down the cost of the commercial skirt cloths. So it actually, they managed to get people starting to buy these lungi cloths and stop spending the time weaving, because it was also didn't save them any money doing it either, right? And it doesn't take very long for some of the skills to disappear under those kinds of pressures, all right? So I think I think all of these things, certainly one of the pressures on Tamang song during the 1950s and 60s was the prohibition on broadcasting song in indigenous languages. So it's really, Gopalji did an amazing job. He archived Tamang song. He's Eastern Tamang, so I should back up. Western Tamang does Mhendomaya among its sort of portrait playful songs. Eastern Tamang does a thing which you probably also have heard called selo. That's what Changbahai is. Changbahai is a jazzed up version of selo. All right. If Gopal Yonjan had been Western Tamang, then the version that his Changbahai would have been a saipole. Okay. But his skill was in working, at least in part, with the indigenous song tradition in the context that was available to him, and with what was quite considerable musical talent on his part. Among some of the current singers, there's a great deal of musical talent, both particularly King Waiba has been extensively trained in classical musical traditions, and also in popular, he also likes to play guitar a lot. So there's a lot of musical talent, and that's a creative talent. So people will do things. As for why things get forgotten, I mean, some of it is when it ceases to be produced, the people who know how to produce it are gone. It doesn't take very long for stuff to change culturally. I remember receiving, in the days when the only way you could get communications from the community, an aerogram. Do any of you know what an aerogram is? No, I didn't think so. Okay. An aerogram, you bought it. It's a pre-stamped letter that was only one page and you couldn't enclose anything. But the great virtue was the stamp couldn't be peeled off of it. And since nothing could be enclosed in it, there was considerable disincentive for it to be investigated by people along the mailing route, right? So it had about a 50% chance of getting to its destination. And I received an aerogram from our closest research associate and host and friend, Suleiman Tamang, who wrote to say, I'm writing today to tell you that Setar Tamang, keeper of our greatest keeper of our song traditions, has died. Who knows how much was lost with her? Right. So this living sense of culture, it's produced by the people who produce it, and in most contexts, when that person dies, if it hasn't been transmitted, it's lost. I think Tamang culture, in some ways, another thing that Tamang communities are in Nepal renowned for are their shamanic traditions. But there was a long period there when no one was apprenticing themselves to shamans. They were going to work in Dubai, right? So David can speak to this more than I can. I think shamanic traditions got pretty precarious in some places.
Can I just take it from there? So how does the Western Tamang song tradition relate? In what way does it relate to place? Does place shape the tradition, and how does it is that heightened through migration and the relationship to place and to song?
Yeah, no, I've been thinking about that, especially since you started talking as heritage, as placemaking. And we're going to have to talk about that a lot more. These Mhendomaya songs, which are about flowers of love, are the place that they care about is love and forgotten love and abandoned love, and rekindled love, which is a social place. It's a place between, brothers and sisters and cross cousins and marriage and mothers-in-law and so on. There are other, among the other song traditions in particular, there are whole songs that do nothing, particularly in the Numter, the origin songs, do nothing except list place names and list places. And they will trace pilgrimage. So there's a one that traces the origin of just to shorthand, of Buddhism all the way back. If you can imagine walking a physical trail over the Himalayas back to Samye in Tibet. So there are song traditions that are literally about place and about, but I'm thinking about it, it's often about getting from one place to the other, right? I mean, in that sense. In a larger sense, though, just as I said a second ago, about the Eastern tradition being in Selo and the Western one being in Mhendomaya, the song traditions are very much associated with localities and with festivals. So have any of you ever been to the big Tamang festival that's out at Swayambanath? Yeah, have you? Did you hear the singing that goes on out there?
This is called the traditions, the songs and all that.
Yeah, I haven't. That's a real question. I can't answer it. I was curious to know, did you notice what kinds of things they were singing there?
I don't know in detail. Surface they can say just follow the traditions and they have their own originality. And nothing I can say more now. Just follow their own kinds of in your way I suggest and they follow that.
Yeah.
And their own traditions, their own so I just know that.
So I think my sense is that in a very, very important way, the specific song traditions are very closely associated with place in this larger sense of being Eastern Tamang, being Western Tamang, and being Northwestern Tamang. So parts of Langtang and Rasua sing quite differently from parts of Nuakot, and parts of Nuakot sing quite differently from parts of Sindupacho. And what will be interesting to see is with the accessibility of all of those traditions through media and through this international migration, the Dading Society of the UK, at least in anything that's available on YouTube of their stuff, they're very devoted to the Western tradition of Tamang. But if I talk with people who come from Eastern Tamang communities, the videos that they send me links to are all Selo songs, and the movies that they're interested in are all Selo based movies.
Yeah,
so there's two questions. I guess there's two things in your question to me, in what I hear. One is, what do the songs have to say or sing about place? And the other is, what does a whole tradition, how important is place in creating an identity that's associated with a song tradition, right? And yes. I think we could find both kinds of things. Excuse me. Sorry.
Yeah.
And you just mentioned about all this new media as well, right? You talked about in your lecture as well, how after 1990s Nepali nationalism and also new FM radio and all this new media has revitalized this song tradition. And now we see this yet new generation of media that promotes that sharing, but also which is more performative. And now we have YouTube, even TikTok, and the various other different kinds of media, new forms of sharing songs. And these are also increasing some opportunities for making it more commercial, these song traditions more commercial and profitable. How do you see that? How do you evaluate these kind of changes? That's like
that's why when I talked about the skirts, I said I can't do that without talking about the political economy, because it's what it's what you can afford to buy, what you can afford to wear, how long it has to last, all these kinds of questions. And there are obviously those kinds of questions to be asked about mediated performances. All of the Tamang singers that I've mentioned here, the ones that were involved, the Mhendomaya Yuva Samaj was successful because it had patrons. Gopal Youngjin was successful because he had a patron. All right, I mean, the question of whether or not these singers and song traditions can move forward to another way for artists to be supported besides patrons. It seems to be a pretty open question. None of these guys are rich. None of these guys have gotten rich doing what they're doing. And Nepal has, Nepal was, I believe, the second to last signator on international copyright law of all the countries in the world. So the tradition of ripping off music and artistic is not only vibrant in Nepal, but it was legal until much more recently than anywhere else in the world. So the question of how you make money doing these kinds of things. Most of the singers in the Mhendomaya tradition, it's the opportunity to go to all these international lochars, and the frustration is lochar just happens on one day a year. So you got to choose. You're going to go to Korea, you're going to go to Dubai, you're going to go to the UK. Where are you going to go? So encouraging local communities to run their own parties, to have their own festivals, to have other kinds of things like this. But I think it's a very real problem for them. Not one that I know of.
We have an interesting question from Tirangi.
So I'm going to read that again for people. You wrote, some of these songs have been used for political purposes. Yeah, yeah. Well, if you talked to Om Gurung, who just recently, very sadly, passed away, who was the first president, or I don't know what the title was exactly, of NAFID, the Nepal Federation of Indigenous Nationalities. The 1990 Andolan was effective because of the mobilization of the Janajati Adivasi. Now, I think there are people who are more situated to answer whether that's a true assertion or not. But there's no question but that in the moments of political turmoil in the 50s and again in the 90s and again in 2006, there are lots of parts of the political movement that your standard political analysts do not, I will say do not understand, not because I understand, but that there were just lots of things, like the first elections. They didn't turn out the way the political pundits thought they were going to turn out. Okay? So the extent to which Janajati Adivasi communities are organized for political purposes is something that I think is really, really interesting. And I'd love to hear other people talk about that a little bit more. Most of these, the Mhendomaya songs that I was talking about, to the extent that they're political, they are about ethnic pride and about identity. And of course, just being Tamang or being Rai or Guru, was not something that you could do with pride until the 90s. And in various periods of fairly modern Nepalese history, it was something that you couldn't do at all. You couldn't do it in indigenous languages. You couldn't publish, you couldn't write, you couldn't broadcast, you couldn't do any of those things. It was very tightly regulated. So the very act of doing it is an extraordinarily political. Beyond that, this is what I hope, that by trying to present some of this material, I hope some of you younger and more vigorous minds will start asking some of those questions, all right? Because I think it's a very, very important question.
Could I ask you one more about heritage and its relation to documentation? And yeah, so can you tell me something about your own experience with the songs, about the importance of forgetting?
Yeah.
And also about the importance of documentation. And we've seen that it has been used as a revival, your documentation. So could you elaborate on that?
I don't know. The heritage, again, what makes heritage and what makes culture vibrant is the people who are actually practicing it. Now, where do you get your inspirations for vibrancy? What gives it some of its power, and particularly some of its authority, is its claim to, world without end. Its claim to not having changed. Its claim to being the roots that go all the way back. Yet anything that we've done. Another project that I was involved in at one point actually happened here in London. I was working in the archives of the India Office, then the India Office Library, and came across a document in Brian Hodgson's papers that was in Nepali. It had never been translated, and it was Tamang Chalchalan, right? And so it was amazing to sit down with this document and go through it. And presumably it was one of Brian Hodgson's assistants who was interviewing a specific historical Tamang man. His name, it tells us where he's from. And then the interviewer presumably was asking a series of questions like, what do you do when a baby's born? What do you do in a wedding? What do you do at the time of first hair cutting? How do you do sati, was my favorite one. And the person would respond. So sitting down with a group of contemporary Tamang scholars and trying to figure out what was going on in this document, and were these really things that were being practiced in the way that the guy was describing it, and what things looked familiar and what things didn't. In many ways, documentation confuses the issue. Right. In many ways, documentation is a reminder that this thing that is claiming to be eternal isn't. And so, on the other hand, because economics and politics and wars and deaths intervene, things really truly can be lost. And some of those things that get lost are truly tragic for whole communities. One of the books that I've read in recent years that has been the most influential is, for any of you who are interested, it's a little book. It's by Jonathan Lear. It's called Radical Hope. And it's about cultural transformation in moments of severe cultural crisis. And so I think that there'll be two different kinds of ways of asking, what's the role of documentation? I mean, on the one hand, since what culture is important about, and songs are only one example, is the vibrancy of creating yourself and making things meaningful, whether it's place or parentage or love. And that has to be produced all the time. If it's not produced, if you're just listening to it or you're just reading it, it's probably not quite the same efficacy.
We could take some questions from the audience if there is anything that you'd like to ask.
Hi. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I was wondering, going back to the copyright system.
Yeah, and these guys, I get to see their name. I don't know your name.
Oh, sorry. My name is Dr. Emily Smith. I work mostly in Nepal, mostly in Gopa, but also in Kathmandu Valley on the repatriation and protection of cultural heritage.
Oh.
And I'm a criminologist. And I'm very interested in the way in which you talked about copyright, and I was wondering what your view on that is, because on the one hand, I can understand that perhaps for you, inventory is the way to go because you preserve as much as possible. But on the other hand, inventories have been a contested method of storage, I guess, and have very much been exploited. So how have you ensured that the intellectual property stays with the local communities that you work with?
That's really hard. And I'd love to talk to you more because I'm not sure I entirely understand the way you're talking about inventories and things like that.
I guess recording. You're
just
recording,
yeah.
you're photographing, you're showing
Right.
communities, you're reproducing.
Right. I mean, I think the first and most important way that, as a working field anthropologist that I use recordings is to give a forum for making sure that I've understood what people have said or done, right? And so I would record an interview in order to listen to it again with that person or with someone else. And because all of this work was done in Tamang, and there was no way to learn Tamang when David and I did our field work. There was almost no way to learn Nepali when we did our field work. So recordings and recordings work better than writing, except for the fact that in those days you had to use batteries, and batteries were not very reliable. They were heavy and they were very reliable. But so for me, in many ways, a lot of these recordings started out as a very specific kind of note-taking for myself, right? For am I understanding what the answer to this question was? Song came in a different way because then people wanted to sing stuff and they wanted to hear it again and they wanted to hear what somebody else had sung. And so this much more interactive kind of process of it. But the question of what the relationship between the scholar and what, from the scholar's point of view, is your research community, but from a human point of view, is the people upon whom you're dependent and the people who are looking at you in a whole bunch of different ways. Some of which is as an advocate for your own traditions, right? Some of which is as a source of opportunity and payment. So a lot of things. I mean, at one point when colleagues in the and friends in the village wanted to support the local school and make it more effective, they asked, for instance, would we be willing to donate the royalties from our books for village community practice? And I don't know if any of you have published as an academic.
All those £3.
Yeah, exactly. But it involves having to be transparent about what kind of money you're making from things. But in fact, the second, it was the second book you mentioned, the Dohori Namaste, the reason that we did that book was because that book was published in Nepal, and all of and we paid for the publication of it, but all the copies were turned over to the members of this school supporting committee, and whatever they could sell them for became money for the school. So the fact that the traditions of how you make money and how much money you make and so on, they are really interesting. Now, it would become a very acute problem, for instance, if someone like Simon and Garfunkel made off with substitute Western Tamang for Andean music song and made a lot of money on it, right? So for the most part, I see my role as trying to work with the community to preserve traditions and things that they wanted to preserve. And neither of us has any none of us has any particular financial motive in it. These singers who have to support themselves and who need to support themselves by singing it, then those questions become a little bit trickier. Do we share the rest of our song tapes, and if so, with which group? And what happens to the original singers and the original families of the singers? And all I can say is, yeah, I'm grateful for things like Zoom now, so you can sit down and do that. I'm grateful for things like Facebook Messenger, so I can call up one or another of these people and say, so-and-so wants me to do this. What do you think of that, right? But I think these are really important issues. And the blue and red skirts, they're now being woven by commercial textile mills in Bhaktapur and sold. And all of the cultural traditions that went into the naming of the different design pieces, now you can buy them in green and yellow and red, and you can get them in everything. So the question of when you move away from people who are engaged in something that is scholarly or artistic or a shared appreciation into something that is potentially commercial, I don't know how to do that. So I mean, I think that's, I will talk with you. It's like, I think I know that the expectations on local levels are often that there is much more profit to be made from it. And most of the singers, when I talk to them, that's a big source of strain for them, because people imagine that they're being paid great sums to perform at the Dotting Society of UK, and they're not.
We have one more question from RK Tamang. Could you unmute yourself? And there's the question already.
Oh,
Nana, Dr. Kathryn.
Nana Lasso.
Lasso, Kanate.
There are some two questions that is going on in context of Nepal within Tamang community. One is the concept of Selo is not the Tamang concept; it's actually the Nepali concept. Has been one logical. Has been some are arguing from that perspective. How do you see that? I think you know more about the context. And another context is after the concept of recording. The previous time they had to create instantly and they sing the song. But this day, because of the recording, the jatra has become more with the big sound, loudspeakers that had already been recorded. And the creation has been, a kind of what, I don't know, can we say the creation and singing has become less priority in this day.
The question about whether it's different if you're playing music, or I like that many of the singers now have all their lyrics on their iPhone so that they won't forget them and sing them. All right. You could talk to my grandparents, and they would be very sad that none of us had to memorize in school, that we didn't have to memorize 3 poems a week and that our memories, we Google something, we don't have to remember it. Certainly when children and young people did not go to school in the community, their minds were enriched by memorizing and learning and singing and copying and recognizing and modifying. In a sense, that was how they enriched their lives. Gave their minds some exercise and some scope. So is it different if you're just listening? I'm sure it's different for the performers and for the listeners, but it might not be changing the actual song tradition as much, because the young people who are sitting around, when Saga Ali composed with his wife, so that they could do these sort of lovey scenes, the songs about taking a bicycle down to Birdaj, they worked hard on those lyrics. They worked really hard on those lyrics. And most people are working hard at their job in a restaurant, or their job in a taxi, or their job at a university. They're not spending the hours and hours and hours that are required to create something that is as skillful and beautiful as either the old songs or the new songs. So I think in the songs themselves, there is still the same kind of cultural energy and creativity and beauty. The fact that everybody who's dancing is not composing and singing, they never were. In the village context, if you listen carefully, there's a lead singer, and then everybody repeats it. So there were people like Setar and like Sharki Lambu who were known to be particularly good composers of song and of singing, and people were happy to have them be sort of singers and leaders in those kinds of things. So I think the tradition, even though it's changing, is still very, very rich. And exactly how it's different for the people who produce it, as opposed to the people who perform it, as opposed to the people who consume it, that takes us into whole sort of studies of communication and what's audienceship, what's readership, what are those different relationships to the tradition, right? There was one thing in your question on the chat that deserves mention, the damfu. There's no damfu in West, I never say, next year damfu will be played everywhere in Western Tamang, I'm quite sure. But right now, and up until now, there has never been any instrumental accompaniment for Western Tamang song. And that was one of the ways people recognized the Eastern, or I'm forgetting the name, maybe somebody knows, the instrument that it's more Tibetan looking. It's got a small bowl and a long, I can't remember the name right now, but that's associated with Northern Tamang singing and not.
Tungna, Nana Tungna.
Tungna, thank you, yes, that's exactly it. Yes, Tungna. So the instrumentation, like the music itself, is very different in these different traditions. But the question that I would love to hear more about, see if anybody knows, I've never heard, but I don't work in Selo traditions. I've never heard anyone try to assert that Selo was a Nepali tradition brought into Tamang, but that could be. I mean, we know the process that M.N. Srinivas in India called Sanskritization, and that was in Nepal called Nepalization. Disadvantaged communities were historically, and still are, under great pressure to model themselves after the dominant community. So it would be totally understandable if a Tamang community appropriated a song tradition that was originally part of that Parvatya Kas, the Nepali context, and made it something even better, right? But I've never that's an interesting thing that I would throw that question out to everybody else.
हजुरले चाहिँ अब धेरै गीतहरुमा काम गर्नु भएको छ। हामीले पछिल्लो समय डीको प्रोजेक्टको डाटा कलेक्सको लागि चाहिँ अब सुदूरपश्चिममा कञ्चनपुरमा चाहिँ हामीले चाहिँ महिलाहरूलाई चाहिँ प्रश्न सोध्दै गर्दाखेरि उहाँहरूलाई हामीले अब इन्टरभ्यू पनि लियौँ। त्यसपछि उहाँहरूको गीत पनि उहाँले गाउनु भयो के।
हजुर।
अनि पछि चाहिँ यो दुईटामा चाहिँ अब हामीले चाहिँ हाम्रो चाहिँ के भिन्नता पायौँ हामीले। मलाई चाहिँ अब आफ्नो के लाग्यो भने चाहिँ अब उहाँको गीतमा चाहिँ उहाँले बाँचेको जुन अनुभव हुन्छ नि गाउँघरमा अब हजुर थाहा त्यो चाहिँ उहाँहरू चाहिँ गीतमा धेरै कुरा आएको जस्तो लाग्यो कि मलाई चाहिँ। त्यो एकछिनको इन्टरभ्यू आधा घन्टाको इन्टरभ्यूले जति गहिराई महिलाहरूले खोतल्नु खोज्छौँ त्यो भन्दा पनि गीतबाट चाहिँ एउटा 10 मिनटको गीतले चाहिँ कति धेरै कुरा भन्यो कि उहाँको आफ्नो व्यक्तिगत लाइफ समाजमा भोगेका समस्याहरू हामीले 6 पौडीको बारेमा डकुमेन्ट्री बनाइरहेको थियो। मलाई त्यसो लाग्यो हजुर त अब नेपालमा त 13 वर्ष काम गरिराख्नु भएको छ है। अनि चाहिँ धेरै समयसम्म काम गर्नुभएको थियो अब एज अ प्रोफेसर रिसर्चर नि। मलाई चाहिँ एउटा प्रश्न के म के सोध्न चाहन्छु भने अब हजुरको चाहिँ अनुभव कस्तो हो यो कुरामा। अब गीतहरूले चाहिँ अब उनीहरूको साँच्चै भाव इन डेप्थमा समेट्छ कि वा चाहिँ काल्पनिक गीतहरू बनाएर त्यसै पनि हुन्छ नि यो रिसर्चमा चाहिँ उनीहरूको चाहिँ यो उनीहरूको चाहिँ बाँचेको जीवनले गीतले रिफ्लेक्ट गर्छ कि गर्दैन भन्ने चाहिँ यसरी।
I think there's an invitation to be part of something larger when you move into poetry or song. It's an invitation to move into more of a larger community, a larger tradition. But that was one of the things that got me interested in song in the first place, because why, when you're talking about something, why do you suddenly start singing? And what does the singing, why are you doing that? What does it do for you? When I play these still, it's so evocative. Now, what it evokes for me can't be what it evokes for you, right? So why am I thinking that if I play this for you, it's somehow going to produce that sensation in you, right? But I think that's a very big question about cultural traditions that are part of a community heritage. And I think that there is something very important about a sense of belonging, whether it's to a social community or to a physical place, that is important. And songs, like other kinds of cultural productions, can do that, and both for the person who's producing it and for the people who then come to participate in it. Even if it's coming from a cassette. I mean, what are all these students that go around with these earphones in all the time, and then they take one out and they put one into their friend's ear for? I mean, there's this sense of participating in something that is larger than you are.
माया पाउँछ धेरै जस्तो गीतहरु चाहिँ कस्तो त्यो गीतको बोल चाहिँ कस्तो थियो भने हामीले माया पाउँछ कि पाउँदैन त्यहाँ उसले के ढिलो बनाइरहेछ चिया बनाइरहेछ हैन बात खोजिरहेछ तर उसले माया पाउँछ कि पाउँदैन भन्छ अन्त्यमा गएर त्यो हरेक दिनचर्याको कुरा गर्दै अनि त्यो चाहिँ एकदम इन्ट्रेस्टिङ थियो हैन त्यो चाहिँ अब काठमाडौँमा बसेर बेलायतमा बसेर हामीले चाहिँ एउटा विकट एउटा चाहिँ अलिकति चाहिँ टाढाको गाउँमा चाहिँ मान्छेहरूको दुःख होला उनीहरूको जीवन एकदम कष्टदायी होला छ नि त भनेपछि गीतमा चाहिँ उनीहरूको साहित्यमा गीतमा त त्यो जीवनको दुःख व्यक्त हुनुपर्ने हो उहाँले कुरा हो त्यो देखिन मैले चाहिँ हैन अब that's so universal and kind of it resonates to people living anywhere in any point of time, like you probably collected them in the 1970s and it makes sense to me now in this time, and so it's quite universal, and it's very interesting to know that people who are not educated and they have a different way of life, they could, like, they were creating these kind of songs which are like,
oh, wait till you see the rhyming scheme in them.
Oh, okay.
Wait till you learn how they rhyme. It's totally amazing. I call it a palindromic rhyme, because we have terminal, in English, it's a terminal rhyme. So somebody give you a poem with a terminal rhyme, right? I went to the sea and what did I see? I saw a car riding on a bar. I mean, we do something silly at the end. These rhymes, when they're well done, come in from both ends to the middle. So you come in and then you go backwards out the other side. It's really hard to do. Yeah, it is extraordinary. Yeah, no, thank you all so very much.
Commissioned music for this podcast has been produced by Vayu Audio Studios. Composer, music arrangement, guitar, tungna, sound mix and master, Vayu. Madal Dime Damaha and percussion, Kunal Singh. Bamboo flute, Anish Maharjan. Recorder, Jaco. Bass guitar, BK. Cello, Celso.